a moment when the Bronze Age world, with all its complexity and sophistication, came crashing down in what scholars now call the Late Bronze Age collapse. And at the center of this chaos stood the Sea Peoples, a confederation of attackers whose origins were as mysterious as their motives. Egyptian Pharaoh Ramesses III, one of the few rulers to successfully repel their invasion, immortalized them on the walls of his temple at Medinet Habu, describing how no land could stand before their arms. But who were they? Where did they come from? For 200 years, since the decipherment of hieroglyphics allowed us to read Ramesses' account, these questions have remained unanswered. The Sea Peoples left no written records of their own, no cities bearing their name, no clear archaeological signature that could pin them to a specific homeland. They appeared, they destroyed, and then they seemed to vanish into the mists of history, leaving behind only ruins and questions. Until now, the mystery of the Sea Peoples has been one of archaeology's most enduring puzzles, a historical whodunit with no shortage of theories, but precious little hard evidence. That is, until scientists learn to read a different kind of record, one written not in stone or clay, but in the very bones of the people who lived through that tumultuous time. The ancient port city of Ashkelon, perched on the Mediterranean coast of what is now Israel, has long been a focal point for scholars trying to understand the Sea Peoples.
They were coming forward toward Egypt. Their confederation was the Peliset, Tejekru, Shekelesh, Denyen, and Weshesh, lands united. Their hearts, confident and trusting, our plans will succeed. This is describing an alliance of peoples who attacked the eastern Mediterranean in the late Bronze Age.
During the Iron Age, Ashkelon was identified as a Philistine city, and the Philistines themselves have been linked to the Sea Peoples Confederation, appearing in Egyptian records as one of the groups that attacked the Nile Delta. The city's location made it a natural landing point for anyone arriving by sea, and its archaeological layers tell a story of dramatic change. Between the late Bronze Age and the early Iron Age, something fundamental shifted in Ashkelon. The pottery styles changed, new architectural techniques appeared, and burial practices took on forms that were distinctly different from what had come before. For decades, archaeologists debated what this meant. Was it evidence of a mass migration, a violent conquest, or simply the gradual adoption of new cultural practices by the local population? The material culture suggested newcomers, but material culture can be adopted without people moving. Trade and cultural exchange can explain many things, and without more definitive proof, the question remained open. Some scholars argued that the Sea Peoples were local populations displaced by drought or famine, while others insisted they must have come from across the sea, perhaps from the Aegean world or even further afield. The debate seemed destined to continue indefinitely, with each side marshaling archaeological evidence that could be interpreted in multiple ways. But in recent years, a new tool has emerged that can cut through this ambiguity with remarkable precision: ancient DNA. A team of researchers, led by geneticist Michael Feldman and archaeologist Daniel Master, working with the Max Planck Institute and other institutions, decided to apply the latest techniques in ancient genomics to the question of the Sea Peoples.
And it's very difficult to identify the Sea Peoples as the singular cause of any particular destruction. Sure, some probably were destroyed by the Sea Peoples, but the archaeologist Eric Klein says they get more blame than they deserve.
They focused on human remains excavated from Ashkelon, carefully selecting individuals from 3 distinct time periods to create a genetic time series that would span the Bronze to Iron Age transition. The first group came from the late Bronze Age, before the Sea Peoples' arrival. The second group, the most crucial, came from the early Iron Age, the period immediately following the collapse when the Philistines first appeared in the historical record. The third group came from the later Iron Age, several centuries after the initial upheaval. By comparing the DNA of these 3 populations, the researchers hoped to see if there was any genetic evidence for a migration event, and if so, where the migrants might have come from. The process was technically challenging, as DNA degrades over time and the hot, dry climate of the Levant is not ideal for preservation. But advances in DNA extraction and sequencing technologies have made it possible to recover genetic information from even poorly preserved samples. The team extracted DNA from the bones of 10 individuals, focusing on infants and children whose remains were found in burial contexts clearly associated with the early Iron Age Philistine culture. And when they sequenced those genomes and compared them to a database of ancient and modern populations from across Europe, the Near East, and beyond, a clear pattern emerged that would finally answer the question that had vexed scholars for 2 centuries. The DNA revealed something that the pottery and architecture had only hinted at. The early Iron Age population of Ashkelon was genetically distinct from the Bronze Age population that had lived there before. The difference was not subtle. The early Iron Age individuals carried a significant component of European-related ancestry, a genetic signature that was completely absent in the earlier Bronze Age residents. When the researchers ran statistical models to determine where this European ancestry might have come from, the best match was with populations from southern Europe, particularly from Bronze Age Crete, Sardinia, and the Iberian Peninsula. The early Iron Age Philistines of Ashkelon derived roughly 40% of their ancestry from a European source, with the rest coming from the local Levantine gene pool. This was not the result of ancient gene flow that had been present in the region for millennia. This was new, a recent admixture event that coincided precisely with the arrival of the Sea Peoples, as described in the Egyptian texts. The genetic data provided the smoking gun that archaeology alone could not. The Sea Peoples, or at least the group that became the Philistines, had indeed migrated from Europe, most likely from the Aegean region or the broader Mediterranean world, and they had arrived in Canaan at the end of the Bronze Age, just as the ancient texts suggested. The mystery of their origins, debated since the 19th century, had been solved by reading the genetic code preserved in the bones of children who died over 3,000 years ago. The Sea Peoples were not a local uprising, not a displaced Near Eastern population, but genuine migrants from across the sea, and the sea they crossed was the Mediterranean, bringing them from the world of the Aegean to the shores of the Levant. But the story that the DNA told was more nuanced and more fascinating than a simple tale of invasion and conquest. When the researchers examined the genomes of individuals from the later Iron Age, several centuries after the initial arrival of the Sea Peoples, they found something unexpected. The European genetic signature had vanished. By the later Iron Age, the Philistines of Ashkelon were genetically indistinguishable from their Canaanite neighbors. The European ancestry that had been so prominent in the early Iron Age had been diluted and absorbed into the local gene pool, disappearing within just a few generations. This rapid genetic assimilation tells us something profound about how the Philistines integrated into the region. They did not remain a separate, isolated population. Instead, they intermarried extensively with the local inhabitants, and within 2 or 3 generations, the genetic distinctiveness that marked their arrival had been erased. Finding challenges simplistic narratives of ancient migration and conquest, the Philistines did not arrive, displace the local population, and establish a genetically isolated enclave. They arrived, settled, and became part of the existing social fabric, even as they maintained their distinct cultural identity. The fact that the European genetic signature disappeared so quickly suggests that there were no strong social taboos against intermarriage, no rigid boundaries separating the newcomers from the established residents. The world of the ancient Mediterranean, it seems, was far more fluid and interconnected than we often imagine, with people of different origins living side by side and forming families together. This genetic fluidity stands in stark contrast to the cultural persistence of the Philistine identity, which lasted for centuries and left a lasting mark on the region, even giving its name to the land, Palestine, derived from Philistia. The implications of this discovery extend far beyond the specific question of who the Sea Peoples were. It provides a powerful case study in the relationship between genetics, culture, and identity, showing how these 3 elements can diverge in unexpected ways. The Philistines arrived with a distinct genetic signature that marked them as outsiders, migrants from a distant land, but within a few generations, that genetic distinctiveness had faded, even as their cultural identity remained strong. They continued to make their distinctive pottery, to build their temples in their own architectural style, to worship their own gods, and to maintain their political independence as a confederation of city-states. Genetically, they became Canaanites, but culturally, they remained Philistines. This disconnect between genetic ancestry and cultural identity is a reminder that human societies are not defined by biology alone. Culture, language, religion, and political allegiance can persist long after the genetic signatures of migration have been diluted and absorbed. The Philistines are a perfect example of this principle, and their story, revealed through ancient DNA, challenges us to think more carefully about what we mean when we talk about the origins and identity of ancient peoples. It also highlights the importance of what geneticists call temporally dense sampling, the practice of analyzing DNA from multiple time periods at the same site. If the researchers had only sampled the later Iron Age population, they would have missed the European genetic signature entirely and might have concluded that the Philistines were simply a local Canaanite population with a distinctive culture. It was only by sampling the early Iron Age, the moment of initial contact and migration, that they were able to detect the transient genetic signal that proved the Sea Peoples had come from Europe. The discovery also sheds new light on the broader phenomenon of the Late Bronze Age collapse, one of the most dramatic and mysterious events in ancient history. For decades, scholars have debated what caused this collapse, with theories ranging from climate change and drought to internal social upheaval and systems failure. The Sea Peoples have often been cast as the villains of this story, the barbarian hordes who swept in and destroyed the civilized world, but the genetic evidence from Ashkelon suggests a more complex picture. The Sea Peoples were not just raiders or invaders, they were migrants, people on the move with their families, looking for new places to settle in a world that was already in crisis. The Egyptian reliefs at Medinet Habu, which depict the Sea People's attacks, show not just warriors but also women and children traveling in ox carts, suggesting that entire communities were on the move. This was not a simple military campaign but a mass migration driven by forces we can only guess at. Perhaps their homelands in the Aegean had become uninhabitable due to drought or conflict. Perhaps they were fleeing the same systemic collapse that was affecting the entire eastern Mediterranean. Whatever the cause, they arrived in the Levant at a moment of profound instability, and their arrival both contributed to and was shaped by the chaos of the age, not caused by a single factor, and the Sea Peoples were not simply destroyers but also survivors, people trying to find a place in a world that was falling apart. Their story, revealed through the DNA of the Philistines, is a story of migration, adaptation, and survival in one of history's darkest hours. Understanding the Sea Peoples through ancient DNA offers lessons that resonate in our own time. The story of the Philistines shows us that migration is not simple replacement but a dynamic interaction where newcomers and established residents negotiate new forms of coexistence. Genetic ancestry and cultural identity can follow different trajectories, with genetic signatures fading even as cultural practices persist. The Sea Peoples, once the most mysterious figures in ancient history, are mysterious no longer. They were migrants from southern Europe who arrived during one of history's great crises and became part of the region's complex cultural mosaic.